At dawn, Silver Pine Lake should have been silent and calm, but one boat kept circling slowly and perfectly with no one driving it. The motor was dead, no figure stood at the wheel, and yet it moved as if something beneath the surface was guiding it, waiting for the first eyes to notice. Daniel Hayes was known to be a fixture of this lake. He launched his small fiberglass fishing boat nearly every dawn, never missing the moment light first touched the water. So when another fisherman named Clark stepped onto the dock that morning, groggy but ready for the day, he immediately recognized Daniel's boat cutting an unusual path. At first, he thought Daniel must be dozing at the helm, but as Clark squinted through rising fog, he couldn't make out a figure anywhere on board. He called out, his voice echoing across the calm lake in a hollow burst of sound. The boat didn't respond. It kept turning. Clark moved quickly, pushing off in his own boat and navigating toward the drifting vessel with a mix of confusion and dread. The closer he drew, the clearer the scene became. A motor that wasn't running, a wheel that wasn't being held, and a boat moving without the physics required to sustain it. Clark reached for the side rail and steadied the vessel. That was the moment he felt it, a slight, unnatural tug beneath the waterline, as if something below resisted the boat being stopped, as if the water itself had intention. Stepping carefully into Daniel's boat, he immediately scanned for the man who never missed a morning on this lake. Tackle boxes sat open and organized, a bait bucket waited half-filled on the deck. Daniel's jacket hung over the seat as though he had set it aside for just a moment. His thermos sat upright, lid twisted off, but coffee barely touched. Nothing appeared in disarray, nothing to suggest panic or struggle. The only element missing was Daniel. It was the life jacket that froze Clark's breath, not tossed aside like an afterthought, but folded neatly over the bow bench. It was an intentional placement, a gentle one, the way someone might leave something behind as reassurance, or worse, as a signal. Clark reached for the radio, flipping it to Channel 3, the lake's emergency frequency. His voice, twice interrupted by static, finally broke through to the harbor office. Within 10 minutes, sheriff boats cut through the water, blue emergency lights visible even against the dim colors of dawn. Authorities boarded with grim caution. They checked for signs of injury, scanning every inch of the vessel for blood, scratches, torn clothing, any indication that Daniel had been forced from his boat. But the fiberglass hull was smooth, untouched. The oars were secured. The anchor line was coiled perfectly. The boat was as composed as a staged photograph, a scene that appeared paused rather than interrupted. The deputy who examined the fuel tank made the first official observation that shifted the case from uncertainty to unease. The tank was completely empty. Not low, not sputtering at reserve. Empty. The motor had no right to run, yet the boat had been circling as though guided by a perfect unseen current. A theory was quietly muttered. Perhaps the boat drifted in circles because of how wind caught it. But the air was dead still. No ripples chased the surface. The fog moved slower than the boat did. That detail alone was enough to fracture normal explanation. Officers radioed for additional support as more residents arrived at the dock. Some recognized the boat and gasped. Others simply stared with growing fear, knowing Daniel would never abandon his vessel mid-lake. They described him as responsible, cautious, the opposite of reckless, a man who respected water but was never afraid of it. The suggestion that he fell overboard or jumped in willingly was dismissed immediately. Daniel knew better, knew it in his bones, that water could be merciless to those who underestimate it. As authorities tugged the boat closer to shore, they noticed something subtle but impossible to ignore. The deck was wet, not unusual, but the moisture pattern was strange. Only a small portion near the starboard edge was damp, as though a single object or footprint had disturbed the dew. Just one. no trail leading away, no companion marks. It was the kind of detail that investigators recognized not as proof, but as a riddle. By full sunrise, the vessel was secured at the marina. Officers sealed the scene, cameras recorded angles from every corner, and divers were called in to sweep beneath the surface. Daniel's family was notified, though authorities offered no explanation, because they had none to give. A missing fisherman with a boat that defied physics left more questions than comfort. The lake, long thought to be a loyal friend to Daniel, now looked like a conspirator holding secrets beneath an undisturbed surface. The wind finally picked up late that morning, sending ripples across the lake that made the earlier stillness seem strategic, as though the water had waited for witnesses before behaving naturally again. Sunrise painted warm light over the town's fear, but the mystery remained colder than the depth at the lake's darkest point. Daniel Hayes had vanished without a sign of a struggle, without a splash, without a trace. And the only witness to his disappearance was a boat that refused to stop moving. Just before investigators closed the scene, one deputy brushed his fingers over the folded life jacket and felt something underneath. Daniel's watch, still ticking, still warm, as if it had just come off his wrist moments before he disappeared. Daniel Hayes was the kind of person whose presence brought calm rather than attention. He didn't seek recognition or noise. He found comfort in predictable sunrises, in the gentle slap of water against his boat, in the soft routines that many people overlook in the rush of ordinary life. At 42 years old, he lived a life carved out of simple commitments to his family, to his work repairing boat engines in the marina shop, and to the lake that had been part of his identity since childhood. If anyone understood the rhythm of Silver Pine Lake, it was Daniel. If anyone should have been safest on its calm waters, again, it was Daniel. He was born and raised in the small town that hugged the shoreline. He could navigate the lake blindfolded. At least that's what his father used to say while handing down fishing techniques learned over generations. Daniel spent summers soaked in lake water, building a childhood around fishing rods and wooden docks instead of screens and schedules. His father used to call the lake their church, a place where silence felt spiritual and patience was a lesson. Those memories stayed with him long after his father passed. When Daniel returned to the water each morning as an adult, it wasn't just a hobby. It was a ritual in honor of the man who taught him to respect the depth beneath the surface. He married young, hoping to build the same gentle life his parents modeled. And for years it worked. He and his wife, Claire Hayes, built a home near the harbor with a backyard that smelled of pine and carried the faint sound of waves when the wind blew right. But life is rarely as smooth as water in the dawn hours. They faced hardship, quiet, slow-moving cracks that distance creates without ever raising its voice. Eventually, they separated, though neither ever quite let go. Claire stayed close, always knowing that Daniel would be somewhere on the lake if she needed him. Their relationship didn't dissolve into bitterness, it just changed shape. That was Daniel's way, never fueling conflict, always choosing steady water over storms. He wasn't a risk-taker. He didn't chase depths beyond his understanding. He checked his equipment twice every morning, once again in the afternoon. People admired that about him: reliability, consistency, peace. There was a kind of comfort knowing Daniel was out there at dawn. It reminded the town that some pieces of life were still dependable. He brought fish to neighbors who couldn't get out often. He taught kids at the pier how to tie knots and cast lines. He was woven into the daily fabric of the community, not a man who stood out, but one who made everything around him feel anchored. Yet within that gentleness, there lingered one truth most didn't know. Sometimes, after the weight of a long week, Daniel would look out over the water, and admit to himself that Silver Pine Lake held more secrets than anyone ever cared to talk about. There were stories he heard growing up, fishermen who vanished during early fog, lights beneath the surface that moved against current, sonar readings showing shapes no one could explain. His father used to warn him that the lake wasn't always kind. Daniel never dismissed those warnings. He simply learned to coexist with them. Claire confided to investigators later that Daniel sometimes woke up from troubled dreams, swearing he heard his father calling his name through water. She treated it as a lingering grief that came and went like low tide. But the detail lodged itself deep in the minds of the detectives assigned to his case. Daniel wasn't careless, he was cautious. If he had sensed danger that morning, even for a second, he would have radioed for help. Yet his radio remained silent, untouched. His last days before disappearing offered no hints of turmoil. He repaired a friend's boat engine, he renewed his fishing license, he bought fresh bait and stored a new thermos in his gear crate. He even talked about taking a day off soon, suggesting he was planning for tomorrow, a mindset uncommon for people on the brink of running away. The evening before his disappearance, he called Claire, his voice steady and warm. They talked about meeting for breakfast after his morning fishing trip. He said he had something to tell her, nothing serious, he insisted, just something he'd been thinking about. The call ended with ease. There were no cryptic messages, no lingering silence, no hidden dread. Daniel Hayes left his driveway before dawn like he always did, in the same truck, with the same boat, guided by routine more than excitement. The sky was still black when he pushed off from the dock, the lake holding only reflections of stars and street lamps. The camera footage captured that moment, his silhouette adjusting the motor, pushing away from the pier, stepping fully into the familiarity of early morning mist. People like Daniel do not simply vanish. They do not abandon their boat without reason. They do not leave behind warm coffee, neatly folded clothing, or watches still ticking as if the body that wore them had only stepped away for a moment. They are not swallowed by lakes that have known them their entire lives. As investigators pieced together who Daniel Hayes was, they found more reassurance than mystery in his identity. A man with steady habits, predictable routes, and no motive to disappear. Every element of his life argued that he should still be here, which led to a single, unavoidable conclusion. Whatever happened to Daniel Hayes did not come from inside him. It came from the lake, or from someone who knew exactly how to use the lake's silence as cover. When detectives told Claire the details of the circling boat and the folded life jacket, her response wasn't shock, but fear. She whispered that Daniel once warned her, "If that lake ever comes for me, it won't be the water you should fear." Silver Pine Lake stretched out like a sheet of glass in the early hours, reflecting dawn in muted hues that made it appear harmless, even inviting. It was the kind of place families visited during summer, where teenagers dared one another to jump from the old wooden pier, where couples paddled kayaks beneath falling leaves in autumn. But beneath that calm surface existed a depth that locals rarely allowed their imaginations to explore. The lake was deep, unnaturally so in some areas, a darkness that swallowed sunlight just a few feet down, and in those unseen parts, stories lingered like silt at the bottom, never fully forgotten, but spoken about only when someone went missing. Daniel Hayes knew those stories deeply. Silver Pine Lake had always been a paradox to him. It gave memories gently and took secrets violently. Over the decades, a quiet list had formed, Unexplained drownings, boats found drifting without direction, night fishermen who reported shapes moving beneath them. Locals chalked most of it up to tragedy or folklore, whichever version let them sleep easier. But the lake's history didn't soften with time. It hardened into a truth everyone sensed but rarely admitted. The water wasn't always honest about what it kept. The area beyond the center of the lake, known among fishermen as Dead Man's Trench, dropped off without warning, a cliff beneath the waterline, carved by ancient earth shifts. Divers had mapped only portions of it. Abrupt currents pushed them away from the deepest chambers. Some said the trench connected to underwater channels leading far beyond town limits. Others believed the terrain itself shifted, like the lake was alive in its secrecy. Nobody could say for certain. That uncertainty became a quiet part of the lake's reputation, respected, feared, and avoided without needing explanation. It was near this trench that Daniel's boat was found circling. What disturbed investigators wasn't just its position, but what had been recorded beneath it. Sonar sweeps captured a moving object in the water below, broad and slow, gliding through the trench with calculated path. Divers dropped in, expecting to find something, a body, clothing, fishing gear, anything to confirm Daniel's location. But the depths revealed nothing. The moving shape vanished as quickly as the sonar pinged it. The water swallowed the signal the way it might swallow memory. Veteran fishermen told authorities stories they once shrugged off as campfire nonsense, large shadows gliding beneath their boats, odd vibrations along hulls, ripples forming in circular patterns without wind. They all said the same unsettling thing. The lake sometimes acted like something inside it was testing the boundaries of its cage. And Daniel understood that more than anyone. Though he loved the water, he respected the parts of it that didn't love him back. Investigators checked environmental data for abnormalities. Water temperature dropped sharply at a depth where it should have been stable. GPS signals flickered unpredictably near the trench, like invisible walls distorted transmission. Even wildlife avoided the middle of the lake. Birds flew around it, never across. The lake wasn't just hiding something, it seemed to be protecting it. When authorities retrieved Daniel's boat and transferred it to the marina for closer inspection, something strange happened. As the hull touched the dock, the lake suddenly shifted, a subtle but noticeable rise, as though something beneath the surface disturbed the balance. For a moment, the water folded back on itself before flattening again, leaving officers staring and unsure whether their eyes had misinterpreted the movement or whether the lake had reacted to losing something it wanted to keep. Scientists assisting the investigation offered rational possibilities. Underwater volcanic vents, gas pockets creating shifts in buoyancy, magnetic interference. Every explanation sounded confident until matched against the details. A boat that moved with intention, not randomness. An object detected beneath it that disappeared before divers reached it. And a missing man who knew the water too well to fall victim to it without leaving signs. Locals whispered another theory, one not found in scientific journals. The lake had moods. Some mornings it welcomed visitors, and others it withdrew, reluctant to reveal what it held. They believed Daniel's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it was the lake taking back something it recognized, a debt long unpaid. That superstition had no place in formal reports, yet it sat heavy in every conversation about Daniel's fate. Detectives mapped the lake's known disappearances over a span of decades. When the points connected, a pattern formed, a rough line tracing the outer edge of the trench. Every vanishing happened near that invisible border, close enough to normality that people ignored the danger, but deep enough that recovery became unlikely. Silver Pine Lake's serenity was a surface-level trick. Beneath it, boundaries existed that no one fully understood. The deeper the investigation went, the more the detectives realized that the lake had warned them in its own way by leaving them only one clue: a boat still in motion. The only visible proof of something unnatural came from the water itself, repeating that slow circular path like a message being traced over and over for those willing to listen. Daniel didn't vanish because he misjudged the lake. He vanished because he knew it too well, and someone or something else knew him just as closely. The water revealed only what it wanted them to see: a boat without a captain. Everything else remained below the surface, in a place where light could not reach. Later that night, as search crews packed up, a diver swore he saw a figure standing waist-deep in the misted center, staring toward shore, before dissolving into the dark water without a single ripple. The footage from the harbor camera was grainy, but still clear enough to capture a life's final known moments. It showed Daniel Hayes arriving at the marina before dawn, his truck headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beams searching for something hidden. He moved slowly, unhurried, as if his body knew the motions even before his mind fully woke. He checked his gear, tightened a strap, knocked the dust from his boots. Every detail reflected a man slipping comfortably into his familiar morning. The same steps, the same order, the same quiet rhythm the lake had learned to expect from him. The timestamp read 5:11 a.m. as Daniel secured his cooler and stepped into his boat. The dock lights glowed faintly across the water, a single reflection stretching into the mist as though tugging his boat forward. He gave one final glance toward the harbor master's office, not anxious, not searching, more like acknowledging a routine checkpoint. Then he pushed away from the pier, drifting into a fog that should have been peaceful, but instead appeared too dense, like it had arrived ahead of schedule. It rolled in low, hugging the lake with a weight that didn't belong to a typical morning. Investigators replayed those last seconds endlessly, searching for the turning point, the moment when everything shifted. At normal speed, nothing seemed strange, but when the footage slowed, details sharpened. Daniel paused mid-motion. His body stiffened subtly, like he heard something that made no sound for the microphone to catch. He turned his head slightly to the right, eyes narrowing as if catching movement in peripheral vision. Then he continued forward, engine humming softly into the fog, the last choice he would ever make freely, as far as police could tell. The camera's view extended only a short distance beyond the dock. The lake swallowed visibility after that. Daniel's boat slipped into a void, leaving behind a faint wake that disappeared as quickly as it formed. Investigators leaned closer to the screen, squinting for shapes, shadows, anything. And that's when the chilling discovery emerged. In the upper left corner of the frame, barely lit by a flicker of docklight, stood another figure, motionless, observing from a distance, a dark silhouette on the far walkway, neither approaching nor retreating. It didn't seem to belong there. No one recognized the shape. The figure vanished the moment fog thickened, and subsequent frames held only empty dock. Marina staff denied anyone else being present at that hour. No boats were scheduled to depart but Daniel's. No night shift workers were missing from their posts. The mysterious figure remained a ghost in the digital record, visible for only a second, but unforgettable once noticed. Along with the video, investigators pulled GPS data from Daniel's onboard system. It should have mapped his route clearly, a smooth line tracking from dock to fishing spot. Instead, the path flickered and broke. First, it showed Daniel headed toward his usual location near shallow reeds. Then, within less than 2 minutes, the signal cut out abruptly, not slowly, not glitching, just gone. When it returned nearly 20 minutes later, the boat sat far closer to Dead Man's Trench than Daniel ever willingly ventured. The abrupt change in direction defied his established pattern. He avoided the trench. He knew its dangers. For him to head there without reason made investigators suspect outside interference. And there was another inconsistency. Daniel never cast his line. His rods stayed clipped to the deck, bait untouched. Whatever stopped him did so almost immediately upon leaving the dock. The sheriff assigned to the case drove the timeline forward frame by frame. Each part of the footage appeared consistent until they reached a single glitch, a skipped frame with a sliver of distortion. When slowed further, it revealed Daniel's head snapping toward the back of his boat. The movement held urgency, a reaction to something unexpected, something behind him. Yet the image provided no clue as to what caused it. Technicians enhanced audio captured from nearby dock microphones. The lake typically carried sounds easily: water against wood, the hum of an engine, distant calls of early birds. But during Daniel's departure, the recording dipped into a hollow silence. No natural noise filtered in, as if the lake had muted itself. One technician described it as the kind of silence that feels like listening through glass. After retrieving the boat later that morning, officers found Daniel's cell phone stored neatly in a waterproof compartment, unusual for him. Claire confirmed he always left his phone in a cup holder while fishing. The fact that it had been put away so early, before he could cast a line or take a sip of coffee, suggested interruption. Something diverted his attention before the day even began. Then there was the fog, thicker than any climatologist could explain. Weather logs from nearby stations recorded normal humidity levels, no temperature drop, no shift in wind patterns. Yet the dock camera footage showed fog behaving unnaturally, rolling in fast, settling evenly, blanketing the lake with surgical precision. It arrived as soon as Daniel pushed off and began lifting shortly after his boat was found. Detectives reviewed historical reports of odd fog formations over Silver Pine Lake. In almost every entry, the sightings coincided with disappearances. Each case was marked by early morning timing, abrupt movement, and equipment failures in the center trench area. Daniel's case was simply more documented, but not unique. That night, an investigator noticed an overlooked detail in the footage's background, a faint reflection on the water's surface, moving counter to Daniel's boat. It didn't appear in the wake and didn't resemble a wave. It tracked beneath the boat, like a large shape pacing it from below, unseen until the sun tried to break the mist. The lake wasn't only hiding something, it was parading a message in plain sight through glitching frames and silent water. When Daniel left that dock, every indicator suggested a normal trip. Nothing obvious warned him, nothing visible approached him, but the moment he crossed a line he couldn't see, the lake reacted. It was as though Silver Pine Lake had waited for the exact second he was far enough from shore and then isolated him completely. Detectives enhanced the figure on the dock one final time and discovered the silhouette wasn't facing Daniel's departing boat. It was facing the camera, as if watching whoever would later look for him. Sunrise had barely peeled the darkness off Silver Pine Lake when the first witness reported something unusual. Not a sight, but a sound. A sharp splash, then a voice that carried just long enough to trigger instinct. It was distant, muffled by fog, and over too quickly to interpret. The witness, a camper named Rich who brewed coffee near his tent on the eastern shore, paused long enough to wonder if someone had dropped gear overboard. When silence followed immediately after, he convinced himself it was nothing. His mind let the sound dissolve into morning routine, and he never turned his head to look. Most people don't stare at what they expect to be ordinary. Just before the boat was found, another man, a night angler named Martin, saw something he still struggles to describe. He remembered glancing toward the trench when he thought he spotted a figure on Daniel's deck, but every time he blinked, the shape dissolved into fog again. He blamed exhaustion at first, the way tired eyes invent motion in stillness. And yet one detail wouldn't let him dismiss it. The figure didn't move like someone bracing for balance. It stood upright, rigid, a silhouette planted at the boat's center, neither reaching nor reacting to the gentle rocking of the hull. It was there and then not like a person fading into distance, but like someone who simply chose to stop being visible. Then there were the kayakers who launched early from the south launch ramp. They were halfway out when they heard something mechanical, a low humming noise beneath the water, distinct from any boat they recognized. It came in pulses, almost rhythmic, like something turning slowly against resistance. They paused, listening carefully, but it vanished each time they tried to pinpoint direction. When questioned later, one kayaker admitted that the sound made the hair on his arms stand up, even if he couldn't explain why. Witness reports shared an unsettling thread, sensory fragments without follow-through. Something was happening, but the lake ensured it remained barely noticed. A woman walking her dog along the northern trail recalled the morning feeling unusually still. Her dog, normally distracted by every rustle and scent, refused to go near the shoreline. The animal tugged backward, tail tucked, staring at the fog pressing thick across the water. The woman tried to convince herself it was a coincidence, even while admitting the moment left her uneasy. It felt like the lake was listening, she later whispered. The most haunting account came from a teenage boy who'd been up all night fishing off the older, less stable pier. He insisted he saw two boats on the lake just before sunrise, Daniel's and another dark shape drifting farther out. The second boat had no lights, no motor running, no sound at all. He pointed it out to his uncle, who dismissed it as a shadow of trees through fog. When investigators pressed for detail, the boy said one peculiar thing. The dark boat never drifted with the current. It stayed exactly where it was, like it wasn't floating, just waiting. That statement struck detectives hard. A vessel that remains perfectly still in a center trench, an area known for unpredictable currents, defied natural explanation. Yet here's the chilling part. Sonar logs from the rescue boats showed no second vessel on the water, no object large enough to be a boat reflected back from the scanners. Either the boy imagined it, or the lake swallowed that evidence before anyone else could confirm. Even environmental microphones placed around the shoreline delivered conflicting audio. Some captured that single splash early in the morning, while others recorded absolute silence, as if the lake selectively allowed sound to exist. Investigators reviewing the audio noted abrupt drops, entire seconds where the soundscape went flat, like someone muted reality. Birds stopped chirping, insects paused, the world froze. Humans weren't the only ones sensing something was wrong. Search teams later examined wildlife patterns from that morning. Deer tracks near the peninsula showed a sudden change of direction, leading back inland as though fleeing something at water's edge. A cluster of migratory birds deviated sharply from their usual flight path, circling the lake rather than crossing it. Even fish behavior recorded by sonar appeared chaotic, schools scattering violently near the trench, then disappearing. People asked why no one saw Daniel fall into the lake. The real question investigators focused on was why so many people heard something, but not a single one saw anything. Because the lake hid the moment Daniel vanished behind a curtain of fog and silence, giving no bystanders a chance to react, only fragments of memory left behind in place of evidence. Witness testimony drew a clear profile of the threat in absence: present but always unseen, audible but never traceable, close but staying outside human attention. That kind of behavior pointed not to accident, but to strategy. When investigators re-interviewed witnesses with new knowledge of the case, patterns sharpened. People who were closest to the trench heard more. Those farther away heard nothing. Like the lake directed its story only to the ones who wouldn't understand what they were hearing. By the end of the second week, detectives realized something could operate in plain view, provided it acted in a way that didn't disturb the water enough to be noticed visually. It wasn't hiding from sight, it was exploiting the failure of human attention. Noticing silence is harder than noticing noise. Search leaders began to fear that Daniel wasn't the first, nor would he be the last, because the threat didn't rely on force, it relied on invisibility. When investigators returned to question the teenage boy a second time, he hesitated, then revealed a detail he had been too scared to mention earlier. On that second boat's deck, he saw someone standing, watching Daniel's circles in complete stillness before disappearing with the fog. The first mechanic to inspect Daniel's boat expected the mystery to collapse under something simple: a stuck throttle, a misread gauge, a faulty sensor. Machines fail all the time, and lakes are places where logic can appear fuzzy if you're already afraid. But the deeper he looked, the more the situation refused any explanation grounded in mechanics. The fuel tank was dry, completely, not a droplet at the bottom. And yet, witnesses saw that boat circling for at least 20 minutes before rescue arrived. Even with a full tank, Daniel's old outboard motor couldn't maintain such smooth rotation with the engine off. It should have slowed, drifted, caught wind or current, but it didn't. The path it traced was consistent, too consistent, as though guided by an unseen track beneath the water. The mechanic examined the propeller next. It was completely still, no rotation markings, no recent thrust. The only marks he found were long, fresh scratches underneath the hull, irregular grooves that indicated the boat had been dragged or pushed from below. The scratches pointed toward the direction of the trench. That single detail drained the room of air. Something moved that vessel. The sheriff ordered multiple physics models to simulate drifting behavior. Wind, barely present. Current, the lake was too calm. Even the slightest environmental push should have nudged the boat into a slow spiral toward the opposite bank, but the models all disagreed with reality. The actual path was too precise, too centered, like a hand guiding it along a loop. Investigators tested the possibility of a snagged line or underwater cable. Divers searched. Nothing connected the hull to anything. The lake floor was clean in that area. No debris, no rocks high enough to bump the hull. A water engineer reviewed torque patterns and motion logs. He said something that unsettled every officer in the room. "If I didn't know any better, I'd say the motion came from below the center of mass, not from the surface." The implication was disturbing. Boats don't move like that unless pulled. Next came the forensic review of the deck. The moisture pattern from earlier revealed more upon closer examination. The water wasn't randomly splashed. It formed a curved trail, a partial footprint, angled inward, not belonging to Daniel's shoes. Something had stepped or stood exactly once, then disappeared without a second mark. Scanned under ultraviolet light, residue from that footprint revealed minerals not commonly found near the shore, deep sediment, the kind that collects where light never reaches. It came from the trench. As this evidence accumulated, fear spread. Authorities tightened control around the lake and cut off access to early morning boating until further notice. But rumors moved faster than regulation. Word reached the community that Daniel's boat had continued moving after it should have died. Some insisted the lake itself had moved it. Others blamed a possible underwater predator. Some believed the boat was a message, a warning to stay away from the center. Then came the most chilling detail of all. Daniel's wrist rods, secured as always at the start of a trip, showed no signs of ever being touched. That meant he never even began his morning routine. Whatever happened, happened immediately, before coffee, before casting, before he drifted far from shore. He was taken at the start, not the end. Investigators studied the boat's GPS device once more. On the recorded path, there was a small but crucial glitch. A sudden burst of acceleration, impossible without an engine, followed by an even sharper loss of momentum, then a smooth rotational drift. It looked like the boat had been shoved. The energy reading matched something hitting the boat square along its underside, not violently, but with directed force. Enough to change course, enough to stun someone standing inside, enough to catch a man off balance and yank him off deck without breaking the surface. That was the element no one wanted to speak aloud. No splash, no thrashing, no noise. Whatever took Daniel did so with calculation. This wasn't panic, this was precision. The divers who investigated those scratch marks emerged from the water shaken. One described a feeling, not a sight, the sensation of being watched from below, a pressure in the water that didn't flow like current, but waited like intent. He refused to re-enter the trench area. When investigators studied satellite images from that morning, fog covered the center of the lake like a shield, thickest where the boat had been found. The shape of the fog pattern wasn't natural. It formed an oval, mirroring the loop the boat traced upon discovery. Fog doesn't usually take commands. It moves with wind, humidity, temperature gradients. But that morning, the fog seemed to obey. As reports circulated through town, people searched for rational comfort. They found none. Instead, they found confirmation that Daniel wasn't the only inconsistency tied to the lake. Years prior, another boat had been recovered drifting eerily near the trench, also without its owner. The fuel tank condition? The same. The motion? Identical. Police had dismissed that case as a tragic accident. Now they realized they had overlooked the pattern. Whatever touched Daniel's boat had touched another before. But the greatest question wasn't what moved the vessel. It was, why did the lake return the boat, but not Daniel? Late that evening, as investigators sealed the boat for further testing, one officer swore he heard the hull creak, not from settling, but like knuckles knocking from the inside, 3 slow taps before silence took over again. There was a moment during the early investigation when everyone still hoped the lake would give Daniel back. Divers in black neoprene suits zipped up their gear and stepped into water they believed they understood. Sonar technicians deployed advanced equipment with confidence. Boats lined the perimeter like a protective ring. It felt like action, like progress, like a rescue still within reach. But that hope lasted only until they entered the trench. The first dive descended along a guide rope dropped directly beneath where Daniel's boat had been circling. The water turned dark almost instantly. Light from the surface only carried a few feet before dissolving into green-black nothingness. Divers communicated via radio, but their voices crackled in and out, interference that shouldn't have existed in a freshwater lake with no significant magnetic disruptions recorded. Yet every transmission felt like it traveled through miles of static. As they moved deeper, currents shifted unexpectedly. Pressure pushed against them from strange angles, not like the smooth rap of water flow, but like brief pockets of resistance, as though something large passed close enough to disturb their path, but remained unseen. One diver later described the sensation as being brushed by a current that had intention. Visibility dropped even further near the slope of the trench. Flashlights illuminated only swirls of silt and the occasional dart of fish fleeing from their beams. Then, in that limited radius of light, they saw gouges carved into the sediment, long, straight scars that led downward like drag marks. The divers followed them until the rope tugged taut. They had reached maximum safe depth. But the marks continued deeper, slipping into a cavernous void the team wasn't equipped to explore. Back on the boats, sonar operators monitored screens filled with shifting shapes, shadows that moved, hesitated, then vanished. Technicians labeled them as unidentified submergent mass. They didn't look like fish. They didn't behave like debris. They moved in purposeful arcs around the trench. Every so often, one of those shapes paused, directly beneath the dive team, and each time divers reported feeling watched, a primal alertness pushing up their spines. Search and rescue protocols call for expansion when underwater efforts fail, so they widened the perimeter, scanning the nearby coves, checking submerged brush lines, exploring shallower shelves. Nothing. Not a scrap of fabric, not a floating lure, not even a bubble that shouldn't have been there. The lake's silence became abrasive. Nature typically leaves behind evidence, and the absence of it was now the loudest signal. As night fell, searchers brought out thermal drones to scan the shoreline. The lake absorbed heat signatures so effectively the screen showed little more than black water and tiny pockets of motion in the trees. Dogs trained to track human scent hit the shoreline at multiple spots, but never along the dock where Daniel launched. Their alert locations were scattered, each facing inward, toward dense patches of forest across the lake. It was as though Daniel had left the water entirely. That discovery triggered a theory shift. What if the lake wasn't where the search should end, but where it actually began? Investigators searched along backwoods trails rarely used by the public. They found broken branches, disturbed loam, and the faint outline of a path that twisted toward an old ranger station no longer in service. The unsettling part? The tracks weren't fresh. They suggested someone or something had traveled that way repeatedly, long before Daniel vanished. A specialist combed through underwater footage frame by frame, hoping something human would materialize. Instead, he stopped at a moment captured just beneath the surface near the trench. The silt clouded briefly, enough to capture a silhouette of something. Not a fish, not debris, a figure, upright, still, watching the divers. Before the camera angle shifted, the figure retreated in a controlled glide back into darkness. When asked to describe what he saw, the specialist refused to label it as a person. His exact words, "Whatever it was, it knew we were there." Then came the moment that shifted the tone from concern to fear. During a dive, the lead diver reported a sound, tapping against the hull of the boat above. 3 sharp knocks, the same pattern officers heard later during equipment transfer. Thinking rescue workers were signaling, the diver ascended slightly and checked the hull. No one at the surface had tapped. The lake had delivered those knocks itself, and after the last one echoed, the dive line shuddered violently, as if something brushed against it with tremendous force before departing at speed. No one wanted to dive after that. Still, professionals return because mysteries demand answers. And yet, every dive ended the same: pressure, static, resistance, and nothing tangible recovered. With every scanned grid marked complete, the search team confronted the harsh truth that lakes do not lose people like this. Bodies rise, evidence floats, grief is found. But Daniel had become a ghost before anyone realized he was gone. In the absence of physical proof, investigators turned back to data. One tech reviewing GPS logs noticed something disturbing. There was a small movement registered from Daniel's phone after his boat had been recovered. The ping originated near the opposite shoreline, where the forest grew thick and paths grew thin. It was brief, just a flicker, but enough to prove one thing. Daniel's disappearance did not end in the water. It continued on land. Someone or something removed him from the lake before rescue arrived. Reports from wilderness cameras were pulled, analyzed, most useless due to fog distortion, but one image caught attention: a dark figure crossing a narrow ridge trail early that morning, just minutes after Daniel's final GPS timestamp. Arms at sides, head low. No details visible, but the shape, the posture, it mirrored perfectly the silhouette seen on the dock camera. And the direction it traveled? Straight toward Dead Man's Trench, but from the land side. When a lake refuses to give back what it takes, questions shift from "where is he?" to "who took him?" and finally to the most terrifying one: how long has this been happening without anyone noticing? The day the underwater search was officially suspended, sonar recorded one last anomalous object rising from the trench, then stopping just below the surface, as if waiting for someone to look directly into the water before disappearing again. For most cases, hope and evidence fade together. Search teams pack their gear, press vans disappear. The community exhales and tries to convince itself that life must move forward. But Daniel Hayes's disappearance refused to follow that pattern. Every attempt to close a chapter only opened another. The lake did not want silence, it wanted attention. And the investigators realized that the only predictable thing about this case was that nothing stayed predictable for long. Weeks passed, and the town of Silverpine changed. Boat ramps, once full before dawn, now sat empty. Kids avoided skipping stones near the docks. Even seasoned fishermen hesitated to cast lines near the trench. The lake hadn't just taken Daniel, it had taken away the sense of safety people once trusted. Locals stopped referring to the event as a disappearance and instead described it as an interruption, a sudden gap, a man removed from his own timeline. Authorities continued following the only thread that still tugged, the GPS anomaly that placed Daniel's phone on land after the boat was discovered. That single ping suggested mobility, movement, survival beyond the water. It wasn't proof he was alive, but it rejected the idea that he drowned unseen. One of the tech analysts described it best. Daniel's story didn't end, it changed location. The forestry team swept through the path leading toward the abandoned ranger station. The trail was narrow and tangled with roots, not a place someone would go willingly without light or guidance. And yet, deep in the brush, they found something that stopped them cold. A small patch of dirt where a shoe had pressed down recently. The tread belonged to a common commercial boot, but the angle was strange. The imprint suggested the foot didn't walk forward, it landed straight down, like someone had been lifted, then set back onto the earth. The path beyond that point felt watched. Even the officers admitted it quietly in their radio chatter, the sense that their movements were observed not by animals, but by intent. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the branches sounded deliberate. No one lingered. They recorded, marked the GPS token, and returned with urgency. Meanwhile, investigators revisited the ranger badge found near the service road. It belonged to Ranger William Price, who vanished 8 years earlier during what officials then called a voluntary disappearance. He had filed multiple reports during his last year on duty, sightings of people near the lake in restricted hours, unexplained lights on the ridge, and boats drifting without pilots. His warnings had gone unanswered. The discovery of his badge near Daniel's case didn't feel symbolic. It felt like a connection snapping into place. 2 disappearances, the same trench, the same strange movement of boats, the same early morning fog, and now the same forest destination. The FBI widened their investigation, reviewing missing persons cases from the region over 15 years. Patterns emerged slowly but undeniably. A handful of hikers, 2 kayakers, a wildlife photographer. None solved, many near water, all during first light, and all with their last known positions close to deep lake trenches or old ranger infrastructure. Someone or something had been collecting these people for longer than anyone had realized. Drone operators ran heat scans across the ridge bordering the lake. Forest canopy blocked most readings, except one glitch. A heat signature appeared for 5 seconds in a clearing and then vanished. When the drone circled back, the space was empty. But on the ground below, investigators found branches snapped at chest height and footprints older than Daniel's, overlapping trails as if dozens had passed through over time, but never in daylight. Claire Hayes, quiet through most of the search, asked to visit the dock one evening after crowds left. She stood at the edge, staring into the water that held every memory of her life with Daniel. She placed her hand on the railing, whispering that she didn't believe he was gone. Not drowned, not lost, just taken. And then she said something investigators didn't record but couldn't forget. Daniel always said the lake listens, but we never asked what it listens for. The investigators who heard her exchanged uneasy glances, because the longer they worked this case, the more they felt certain the lake wasn't just a setting, it was a participant. There was a final, unsettling discovery. One last analysis of Daniel's smartwatch data revealed microtremors recorded in the seconds after the step count ended, vibrations consistent with rapid elevation change, not falling deeper, but being lifted upward, extracted. Daniel didn't sink into the lake, he rose out of it. Someone removed him from below the sightline of every witness, and they moved him to the forest before the world woke up. The disappearance of Daniel Hayes didn't feel like an isolated crime anymore. It felt like part of a design, a method perfected through trial and error, protected by fog and water and silence. Silver Pine Lake wasn't giving up its secrets, but it wasn't finished either. Because near the end of the 7th week, as investigators reviewed the growing number of open cases, another call came into dispatch. Panic, hysterics, words tripping over one another. Another boat circling the lake, at dawn, with no one aboard. And once again, the fuel tank was empty. This wasn't a single tragedy. It was a repeating pattern, a moving target, a story that refused to stay underwater. When officers reached the dock, that second boat drifted slowly toward shore, and on its bow, placed neatly and dry, was Daniel's missing thermos, still warm. Daniel Hayes didn't vanish into the lake. He was removed from it. His boat came back, but he didn't. And every new clue proves his story isn't finished. The lake has been taking people for years, hiding disappearances behind silence and fog. Now, with another empty boat circling at dawn, the pattern is no longer rumor, it's a warning. Someone out there knows the routine better than the victims do. Silver Pine Lake hasn't claimed its last name, it's waiting for the next one. Before you go, think about this. If Daniel's routine could become a blueprint for a disappearance, how safe is anyone's morning ritual? We're still uncovering clues from lakes and trails just like this one, mysteries that don't stay buried for long. Stick with us as we pull at the threads others stopped noticing, because somewhere out there, someone knows exactly who they're coming for next. Where were you at dawn today?